Hey crew, before we get started today, I just wanted to make you aware, if you weren't already, that the Seventh Rule podcast has organized an online Star Trek convention to fill the hole where STLV would have been this summer. It's called Virtual Trek Con, and it launches today, July the 15th, and it runs until the 20th. It's all available on YouTube. You don't even need a pass. It's all free. They've got guests like Nana Visitor, Tim Russ, Doug Jones, Michelle Hurd, Nichelle Nichols, Alexander Siddig, and many more Trek actors, writers, and artists talking about their experiences in the franchise, the science of Trek, Trek movie talk, and much more. If you want information, go to virtualtrekcon.com and click on How to Participate to find out about the 2 virtual stages that they've got going for this. And when the con is done, why not go to enterprisingindividuals.com and check out some of my past interviews with some of those same guests, talking Trek and their contributions to it. We've got a great guest today on the show. I'm talking with Fred Love, who is a writer, a musician, and a contributor to Star Trek Adventures. That's the Star Trek role-playing game published by Modiphius Games. They recently announced their Klingon Empire supplement book, which Fred contributed to, and it's scheduled to release this fall, but you can pre-order it now. I'll leave a link in the show notes where you can pick that up. I'll also mention quick that Fred is a game master himself, and he regularly runs Star Trek Adventures games. He's got a campaign running currently called Star Trek Explorers, which he runs over Skype, and the video of those sessions are available on his YouTube channel. So you can go to youtube.com and search for Fred Love Star Trek, or I've got a link in the show notes if you want to see Star Trek Adventures in action. I had a lot of fun talking with Fred. He's a thoughtful guy, and he picked a great hour of Voyager for this episode, so I hope you enjoy it. It feels good to be back. That's it for now. Check out Virtual Trek Con this week. I'll talk to you again next week. And with that, let's get underway. Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and Harry Kim travels 70,000 light years across the galaxy, and a Vulcan children's choir is performing at the reception. Harry and the Kimtones need a new booking agent. My guest on the show today is Fred Love. Fred is a freelance writer and RPG designer who has written for games such as Star Trek Adventures and Tiny Supers. He's also a singer-songwriter. His debut solo album, Lily of the Valley, is available on Spotify, Amazon, and downinthevalley.com. Fred, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to talk to Aaron.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about Timeless, the 6th episode of the 5th season of Star Trek Voyager. Pity poor Harry Kim, a Starfleet cadet with unlimited potential, valedictorian of his academy class, editor of the school newspaper, first chair clarinet for the Juilliard Youth Symphony, a 3-time Parrises Squares champion. And on his first assignment, he's catapulted into the Delta Quadrant to likely die of old age before ever returning home. Like many young people with promising futures, Harry could have given up when life turned out to be more complicated than he had been led to believe. But Harry grew up fast and realized his nascent potential to successfully bring the Voyager and her crew home again. Just don't expect him to get a promotion for it. But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, Fred, it's great to have you here. I always ask first-time guests to the show how they first discovered Star Trek. How did you become a Star Trek fan?
Wow. So, yeah, I would have to go back a long ways. I think I was probably in kindergarten when I was first exposed to Star Trek. This was in the early 90s, and Star Trek The Next Generation was really kind of hitting its stride and becoming a cultural phenomenon. And so I think my folks had introduced me to the original Star Wars trilogy first, and I watched those and really enjoyed them. And then I saw this thing on TV that kind of looked like Star Wars, had spaceships and aliens, but then just a few minutes of watching it, I realized it was very different and much more my speed and maybe more fully realized.
Yeah.
And it was an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I've been basically watching Star Trek ever since. I collected all the Playmates action figures and toys, and still have those to this day. And I've just been following the franchise. There's never been a point since then where I have been following the franchise pretty closely.
I've been thinking a lot recently about, I mean, we don't always talk about the Star W word on this show, but sometimes we do. And the franchise of Star Trek really owes a lot to Star Wars, simply because of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which, of course, would probably never have seen the light of day without the runaway success of Star Wars. And that was sort of part of the problem of the reception of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, because Star Wars, of course, presents this, bombastic sort of Western in space. And then TMP comes along and people are like, what? It's just looking at the ship for 12 minutes and flying through a thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the success of Star Wars has maybe been a gateway for a lot of folks like myself into more science fiction franchises, but yeah, the Star Trek is definitely maybe a little more cerebral, a little more methodically paced, maybe involving some bigger ideas, and that's what's always, I found that's more appealing to my sensibilities.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, it's good to hear that you're a success story then in conversion. I've always wondered about like the Star Wars universe, and there's so much material that I'm sure that I'm missing something, but I would like to see a more cerebral take, a more thoughtful take whenever they have, it has elements of Eastern philosophy and religion in it with the Force and Jedi and things like that, but just something that's a little less blastery and a little more moral quandaries, and things aren't painted so black and white. But maybe that's just integral to the appeal of Star Wars, knowing who the good guys are, knowing who the bad guys are. Yeah,
you might be right. I would watch. I mean, I still go to all the Star Wars films. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd watch some Star Wars storytelling that maybe is a little more like what you were talking about.
Yeah. I think they sort of dabbled with that a little bit in the most recent sequel trilogy, but I didn't get too deep into it. I know that you've been writing for the Star Trek Adventures RPG by Modiphius. How'd you get started working with them?
So my involvement with Star Trek role-playing games goes all the way back to Last Unicorn Games, back when they had.
Now you're talking my language, yeah.
Yeah, all right, awesome. So I think I was in high school, right around like 1999, 2000, the early 2000s, when I first saw Star Trek: The Next Generation role-playing game from Last Unicorn Games on a shelf, and bought it without any real experience with role-playing games, just kind of a vague idea of what a tabletop role-playing game is. And so I bought this book and got a couple of friends together in high school and ran a handful of sessions and just kind of fell in love with the idea that you could kind of run your own Star Trek series at the table with your friends through tabletop role-playing. And so I followed every iteration of Star Trek's tabletop role-playing game since then. When Modiphius announced that they had the license several years ago and we're going to do a play test, I knew that I just desperately wanted to write for it. And so I just kind of looked up an email address on the Modiphius website and sent them a blind email saying, I've done some writing for tabletop role-playing games. I know Star Trek really well. I would love it if there was an opportunity for me to contribute to this game. And they told me that they were looking for pitches for adventures. And so I sent them a pitch, and to my surprise, they accepted. And so I've written short scenarios for the first two scenario books. One's called These Are the Voyages. The other one's called Strange New Worlds. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote some for the Delta Quadrant source book, which is more like setting material and very drawing a lot from Voyager episodes, as you might imagine.
Sure.
And hopefully there's more in the pipeline as well that I can't talk about quite yet. But the Star Trek Adventures line is going in some really exciting directions.
That's great. I mean, writing for a Star Trek RPG has to be difficult because, it's a series that's been on for over 50 years. There's 8 shows and hundreds of hours of material. Do you ever have an idea and then you're like, no, they did that on Voyager, or, oh, no, I think they did this on an animated series episode. I don't think I can do that.
That's an interesting question because I don't really shy away from, I'm pretty ruthless and just like stealing ideas from my favorite episodes and Star Trek films. Sure. Because I think if you want to play in a Star Trek tabletop role-playing game, the reason you want to do that is because you want to feel like you're taking part in an episode of Star Trek that you might see on screen. Yeah. So I'm really I'm a big fan of putting my players in situations that are really similar to what they saw on the screen, but then allowing their characters to respond to those situations in ways that are more in keeping with how they would respond rather than, the characters that they saw on television.
Yeah.
I really try to recreate the feeling of a Star Trek episode at the table.
Yeah, and it's so great how, like, just the structure of Star Trek, Captain's Log and the sort of missions, hour-long on TV, but, however long they are at the table, just give themselves really well to the role-playing structure. I remember that I played Last Unicorn, a Trek in the 90s, too, and I had a group of friends that we played. We had about a 6 or 7 year long campaign where we took these characters from ensign all the way up to like captains and admirals. All the while, we've got 2 series of Trek on TV, and it just felt like, oh yeah, we're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's maybe the most rewarding part of role playing games is watching your characters kind of grow and develop organically, and the stories that you get to tell with your friends, and building those stories at the table. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that.
I've had a couple writers for STA on the program, and I myself have been trying to get a game going with some listeners. I know you've got a game that you're running currently, Star Trek Explorers, that you're streaming on YouTube, and playing remotely or over the internet is a new frontier for RPGs. But of course, now in the time of COVID, it seems like a better idea than ever.
Yeah. So my thinking was, obviously, this is a stressful and difficult time for a lot of people. And so the idea of an original series era campaign played remotely with all of that optimism and hope that was such an integral part of the original series, it just seemed like the right time for that. Yeah. So yeah, I'm two sessions into what I call Star Trek Explorers. It's just an original series era Star Trek Adventures game based on a Constitution class starship exploring the unknown. And hopefully we've got plenty more sessions coming up. But hey, if you ever wanted to play a game sometime, I'd love to run one for you, Aaron. If we could work out the schedules.
Well, if people want to check out Star Trek Explorers, they can on YouTube, on your channel. Is that right?
That's right. Yep. On my YouTube channel. I also do some kind of quick videos just about some of the stuff that I've written for Star Trek Adventures. And I'm just trying to populate more and more content on that YouTube channel and let people know that Star Trek Adventures is a great option for scratching your Star Trek itch. And it's a great way to tell your own stories in the final frontier.
Absolutely. I'd imagine that as a musician and somebody who performs publicly, you're doubly affected by social distancing and the canceling of events and gatherings.
I'm lucky in the regard that my music has always just kind of been a side hustle. I've got a full-time job at Iowa State University. And so I'm lucky that my job allows me the flexibility. I'm working from home right now. Most people at the university are. So I'm still... my day job is going just fine, but yeah, that side hustle is basically kind of down in the dumps. I don't have any gigs scheduled until like August, and who knows if those will even happen. So very tough time for creative people whose livelihoods depend on touring and live performance.
Yeah, and hopefully, we're all hoping that everything will sort of bounce back and even see a resurgence, an increase in people appreciating live events and seeing their favorite bands and acts. I know personally, and I'm not exactly sure why, I've always been a Bob Dylan fan, although I haven't listened to him regularly in a few years. But for some reason, recently, before I go to bed every night, I've been spinning up some Bob Dylan albums. And just for some reason, it feels like the right kind of music for what's happening right now.
Yeah, I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, too. And I'm finding that it's just really comforting to go back and listen to some of those albums that really mean a lot to me, but maybe I haven't listened to them in a long time. Right now, during the difficult time that we're in, it's just nice to hear a comforting voice, a familiar voice, and get a little comfort that way.
Yeah. Where can people go to find out more about your music?
My music website is fredlove, FREDLOVE.info. And you can find some videos and some recordings from my album and my gig schedule. Like I said earlier, there isn't a whole lot on the gig schedule right now, but hopefully that'll change in the months ahead.
Why did you choose this specific episode, Timeless, to discuss today?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was just kind of a front of mind when I was invited to be on the podcast. I just watched it recently, and it's among my favorite Voyager episodes. I think it does a great job of balancing the two different timelines that the story takes place in. It also just felt like kind of emblematic of Brandon Braga style storytelling with the time element. It felt like just a really good good example of Star Trek storytelling from the time period in which it was produced.
Yeah, it's kind of a time travel episode without time travel. It's really only, information, like the message that Harry sends that is the time traveling thing. And so it's unique in that way. We've been talking a lot about Voyager on the show this year, and we've been talking about how it was sort of a return to quote unquote regular Star Trek after the narrative departures of DS9. I mean, sure, you've got this baked in premise that they're always trying to get home, but setting that aside, they're just another Starfleet vessel doing what they do from week to week, exploring, being diplomatic, seeking out at all. And in a lot of ways, they both refined and innovated the regular formula of a TOS or a TNG, I think, both in terms of storytelling and in subject matter. Voyager got really good at starting stories in medias res, just picking up in the middle of a crisis or scenario, doing away with a lot of the, captain's log, here we are, and then we find ourselves in a predicament. This episode is a great example of that. In the Flesh is an episode that happens one or two episodes back from this, which is another one where it just picks up and it's like, where are we? What's going on? And they trust their audience at this point. They'll get it. They'll sort of catch up to where we are.
Yep, absolutely. I would say, to me, I see kind of a lineage from this episode, Timeless, that maybe stretches all the way back to like Cause and Effect in The Next Generation. That was the one with Kelsey Grammer, where they kind of repeat. They're in like a time loop and they repeat stuff over and over. And that was another story that I think Brannon Braga had a lot to do with shaping. And to me, there's kind of like this is another episode in that sort of series of these sort of high concept, timey-wimey kind of stories.
Yeah, right. And Voyager did a lot to expand the world of the 24th century and the Federation. Even though they were cut off from the Alpha Quadrant, we still got a lot of episodes that explored both specific character foibles as well as broader issues like religion and the rights of artificial life and the development and application of new technologies, diplomacy, the limits of the Prime Directive. Like, they continued that tradition even on this show with this strange premise where we have to just get home.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
And, it's a lot like writing a Star Trek RPG when you're writing a series that's coming 30 years after other Star Trek stories. It's got to be hard to keep it fresh. And I think Voyager did really good work in taking a lot of premises that had showed up previously on TOS or TNG and putting a new spin on them. You mentioned Cause and Effect before. I think this episode is in a lot of ways kind of Voyager's Yesterday's Enterprise. But they found a way to retell a similar story to Yesterday's Enterprise, but make it more personal and make it sort of centered on the life of a specific character.
Yeah, in this case, I think you're probably talking about Harry Kim, which is an interesting choice to me, because Harry is as nice a guy as he is. I've always thought of him as a fairly bland character. I would never say that Harry Kim is one of my favorite Star Trek characters. Yeah. So they kind of give him a twist in this episode where they show him in the future timeline where he's living with all this regret. He's isolated and basically obsessed with correcting this big error that he committed in the past. So he's a very different character in the future timeline than the character that we know from the first four odd years of the series. And that contrast is actually really interesting. I think I found the future Harry Kim more interesting than the present time frame.
Yeah. Well, we've swapped Harry Kims before. Maybe we could bring future Harry Kim back to Voyager and just go with that.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, have you been watching Star Trek Picard?
Yes, I have. Absolutely.
Yeah. They mention in this episode that they got this, this Borg transponder or temporal transceiver or whatever it was from a crashed Borg cube in the Beta Quadrant. And of course, it's all retroactive continuity, but I wonder if that refers to the artifact in their timeline, the crashed cube that we see in Star Trek Picard.
Yeah, I think that's a total possibility. In my head canon, that's absolutely where that transceiver came from, where that stolen Borg technology came from. They said, there was some kind of Borg cube in the Beta Quadrant, and they were able to steal Borg technology that allowed them to transmit their message back to 7 of 9 in the past.
We found it on this planet where everybody had gold skin and they were playing hacky sack all day. It seemed like a nice place.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking the Voyager episode Timeless, the 6th episode of the 5th season of Star Trek Voyager. It first aired on the 18th of November in 1998. The teleplay was by Brandon Braga and Joe Menosky, who we have talked about many times previously on the show. Suffice it to say that they're both writer-producers who were heavily involved in Voyager and the Trek franchise. The story is by Rick Berman, Brandon Braga, and Joe Menosky. And of course, Rick Berman served as the executive producer on TNG, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise, as well as co-creating DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. It was directed by LeVar Burton. That's a familiar name. We'll talk more about him in a little bit. The in-universe date, the star date, is 52143.6. I should also mention that the Borg time index for this episode is 9.43852. And of course, we have a future timeline in this episode. No star date given, but the calendar year is 2390. And your assignment, Fred, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of Timeless.
Okay, 25 words. Geez. A disillusioned Harry Kim in the year 2390 sends a message back in time to save Voyager.
Perfect.
That would be my one-sentence summary.
Yeah, that's a good blurb. Yeah. Most writers on the show usually go into like a full-on pitch. They're like, all right, we're in 2390. There's an ice planet. 2 men beam down. It's like, all right, you're already through the 25 words here. Here's some interesting facts from the memory banks about this episode. Many episodes of Star Trek or any TV show often start with a singular idea or an image, and the same is true of Timeless. The image of Voyager buried under ice came to Brandon Braga, and he worked with writer Joe Menosky and writer and story editor Brian Fuller to develop the idea. While developing the script, Braga and Menosky sought to avoid the usual twists and turns of typical time travel stories, keeping the action firmly in 2 separate time frames, with only Harry's messages traveling back to the past. Menosky and Braga provided a great deal of detail to some aspects of the script, even specifying how much ice the ship should be seen under in the episode's opening. They also worked to make the episode's teaser nearly dialogue-free. Other aspects of the script were less outlined. Their sequence for Voyager's crash was just half a page, according to Menosky, and it would be up to the visual effects team to give the ship an impressive and tragic death. In realizing the shot of Voyager encased in ice, the visual effects team struggled with how to portray it conceptually, and they produced a number of sketches of the ship, both partially encased and sticking out of a glacier, but Braga was insistent on his vision of the ship being submerged, and the final effect was achieved through the use of a digital matte painting. Voyager's crash landing was achieved with both digital and practical effects. The sequence was attempted fully digitally, but the particle effects depicting the snow weren't up to the show's high standards. The sequence was finally completed with a CGI Voyager and real baking soda standing in for snow. And that reminds me of, if you watch a documentary about the making of, again, a lot of Star Wars in this episode, The Phantom Menace, when you see Naboo, there's this great shot of the palace, which is up on this plateau, with waterfalls. And apparently the waterfalls were made with sand, with like white sand, like the kind of sand that you have on a beach or like in an old time ashtray. They would just run that through and then slow it down and then comp that into this beautiful matte painting they had of the Naboo Palace.
Yeah, it was interesting that you mentioned that there was baking powder. Is that what you said it was?
Baking soda, yeah.
Baking soda that was used as the snow or the ice on the set. I remember the last time I watched it just a couple of weeks ago, and I was thinking, man, I would hate to be the person that had to vacuum and clean up all those sets after they got done filming, because it was just all.
In a lot of ways, Voyager has been through quite a lot, in its life on the series, and probably one of the easiest, but also somewhat difficult to clean up ways to change the set is to do that freezing effect. If you look at like old TOS episodes, like The Naked Time, they must just spray everything down with like a white foam or something like that, so it looks all fuzzy, and then you can just like chisel it off, I suppose, but it would still take a little time.
Yeah, I would think so.
Everybody was fairly happy with the completed episode when it aired. Menosky praised the episode's imagery. Berman credited it as one of his favorite for the series and the entire run. Braga called it a perfect episode, and Fuller said that it hit on all cylinders. This episode is the first Voyager episode to feature a Galaxy-class starship in the form of the USS Challenger. The Challenger's registry number was NCC 71099, and it's a tribute to the Space Shuttle Challenger, whose designation was OV-099. Timeless depicts the 8th time, not counting the premiere, that the Voyager crew has had a solid chance of getting home and has missed out. It's also the 3rd time on the show that the ship is destroyed. It's the 6th time that Janeway dies in the series, and it's the 3rd time that we see Harry Kim die as well. And of course, it's worth pointing out that this episode has many parallels to the series finale, Endgame, in which a character from the future attempts to alter Voyager's past. Both episodes hinge on the use of Borg technology. Let's talk about the guest stars in this episode, and there's only two. Christine Harnos appears as Tessa Omond. Harnos appeared in a number of films and TV shows in the 1990s, and she had a recurring role as Jennifer Green, the ex-wife of Dr. Mark Green on the series ER. And of course, in addition to directing the episode, LeVar Burton reprises his role as Geordi LaForge, now a captain and the commander of the Challenger in this future. Burton directed 29 episodes in total of the 4 Berman Trek series, and Brandon Braga specifically requested Burton as the director of this episode, and it was late in the process of writing the script that he also asked Burton to reprise his role as LaForge in the episode. LeVar Burton found the production of the episode to be somewhat challenging, specifically in having to shoot the frozen future Voyager and having the sets quickly redressed to then again look normal for the other timeline. And this is the 100th episode of Star Trek Voyager, which is, of course, a milestone for the series. The production threw a set party for the cast and crew, which was also attended by past writers and cast members of the show. And I think it's cool. The party in the beginning of the episode where they're celebrating Voyager's new warp drive and it being christened, I think parallels that celebration of it being 100 episodes.
Yeah, I think that was a really nice touch. And one of my absolute favorite parts of this episode is during that celebration scene when Seven of Nine has a single glass of champagne and can't hold her alcohol, and the doctor has to escort her out of engineering, and she keeps saying, "We are as one.
Right.
We are as one."
Yeah.
I love this scene. I love that. I laugh out loud at that every single time I watch it. I think that's a great example of Seven of Nine, who often comes off as this sort of alien and cold character, but they found ways to make her, to give her a sense of warmth and family with the crew, even when she was oftentimes an outsider. And that's one of my favorite moments for Seven.
Yeah, her getting white girl wasted on champagne. I think there's a couple mentions like later in the series where I think she becomes kind of abstemious after that because she's offered, alcohol. She's like, it's not for me.
She learned her lesson.
Yeah, she learned her lesson fast. Let's talk about the episode itself. And specifically, I want to talk about the character of Harry Kim. You mentioned before that you wouldn't describe him as your favorite character, but what's your overall impression? Good enough? Could they have done better with Harry Kim? They should have never replaced him when he got sucked out of that airlock. What do you think about Harry Kim?
Well, yeah, like I said earlier, when I look at Voyager's cast, I think that there's some real highlights in Seven of Nine and B'Elanna, the Doctor. I think those are great characters that really belong in the pantheon of great Star Trek characters. Yeah. Harry Kim would not be on that list, and I don't think it was the fault of Garrett Wang, the actor, or anything. I think they didn't really know how to develop him much beyond this sort of bright-eyed, dedicated, competent ensign. Yeah. I think there's some great moments between Harry and Janeway over the course of the series where she takes on kind of a mentor, maybe even like a motherly kind of role for this young ensign. But he just kind of comes off as kind of bland and eager to please, which to me seems kind of cloying. So no, I would definitely not describe Harry Kim as a favorite character of mine, although I think this would probably be his high point in the series, in my opinion.
Interesting. I think it's too bad because, of course, and I think with the advent of CBS Trek, they're willing to sort of challenge more this idea of the utopia that we see in the Federation not being perfect necessarily. And not just politically, like being able to show more flawed characters, but I think that it's a missed opportunity because he is somebody who comes with all the gifts. Like he really should be, like when you hear that, like Will Riker was the head of his class and he's being groomed, to be the best captain in Starfleet. He is that, and he is, an excellent officer, and we see that. But having somebody like Harry, who has all this potential and then is thrown into this horrible situation in the way that it sort of subverts what he thought he was going to get out of his life, and yet having to rise to the challenge and, do something kind of different. Like in a lot of ways, I think of him as Wesley Crusher done right, or at least done better. Like they're both, these kind of wunderkind characters. And Harry Kim's like, he's potentially like dislikable, but he's not as like crazy pretentious like Wesley. I think they did a good job of making him a little bit precocious, but he embodies for me the idea of that like perfect Starfleet cadet or young officer. You know, he's a genius. He's packed with science and training, but he immediately learns that book learning and potential aren't going to be enough to survive what he gets into. And where Wesley experiences disappointments and challenges, and eventually he just says peace out and he leaves Starfleet and goes with the Traveler. Harry sticks with it, and he becomes more and more seasoned as the series goes on. But to be fair, he didn't have much choice except stay on Voyager, I guess.
Yep. I think that's an interesting comparison you make with Wesley Crusher, who I think does come off as standoffish and unlikable early on in the Next Generation. And I would not say that is the case with Harry Kim. I think he's perfectly likable.
Yeah.
He's a perfectly competent officer, and he makes friends. And I think Garrett Wang had good stage presence. They just never really had a whole lot of great ideas to take his character, I guess, over the course of the show. And I really like the idea that you mentioned, that he had this plan for this great trajectory in a Starfleet career that is almost immediately interrupted by this wild and crazy detour into the Delta Quadrant that could totally derail his career aspirations. And maybe exploring that would have been pretty interesting to see this guy who has dreams of a career in Starfleet try to come to terms with the fact that he might never get off this ship, you know?
Yeah. And to really explore that and develop that, you really have to sort of track that from at year to year and season to season. And Star Trek, especially at this time, exists at a weird place in TV storytelling because every new show or successive plot is based on some pre-existing element in the universe. But when it comes to the individual stories and characters, when they're writing weekly scripts, they're essentially just going with the weekly reset. An episode starts, and it really doesn't matter all that much what happened last week. And DS9 did a lot, I think, against the wishes of the people in charge, did a lot to bring serial storytelling and long-term character development to Trek. But the characterization on Voyager, it's often kind of inconsistent. But that said, Harry comes a long way from needing his clarinet and his sleep mask to, being an important part of the crew, building warp cores and such. But I know I'm sure he probably said yes, mom. I mean, yes, ma'am, like a couple of times before we got everything straight.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, he's mostly just Ensign Harry Kim. As the series goes on, I think it's like the wacky episodes where we really get to explore his character the most. Episodes like The Killing Game, where everybody is having this, World War II fantasy, and he's just getting kicked around by Herodians and having to like survive on his own. Or seeing him as an older captain in Endgame, or this episode, Timeless. It's almost like we have to make him not Harry Kim to really explore new facets of Harry Kim.
Yep, and I think that's a perfectly good move to contrast what we know about a character with these other sort of alternate reality versions of that character, and it can tell us something about the character that we know and love. But in this case, I worry that the character of Harry Kim, he's more interesting in the alternate realities. And then when we come back to the real Harry Kim that we know and love, we think, oh, maybe it would have been more interesting if we would have gotten to know that other version of him better.
Yeah, I don't want to be interesting. I just want to play my clarinet. Come on. Play some Parisi squares. The writers really made a point of trying to feature underserved characters in the 5th season, and I think Timeless was their play at making Harry a more complicated hero and giving him layers. And Garrett Wang asked Brandon Braga about how he should portray this older Harry. What would he be like? And he asked if there was like a pop culture character he could look to. And Braga suggested Mel Gibson's character from Lethal Weapon, Martin Riggs, which I don't exactly see in his performance, but I think that it was probably more about the idea of this man who had lost everything, and he just really didn't care at this point about anything except in this case, saving the crew in the past. And you get flashes of his anger in the episode. I also like how he just doesn't have, the only thing he cares about is fixing this problem, and so the doctor is trying to gently find out the relationship between Chakotay and Tessa, and he's like, they're having sex. Can we move on?
Yep. The only motivation for this character now is that he wants to correct this grave mistake that he made, and I don't think he really worries about the consequences, both for those around him and for himself. I think on this one last mission, if he dies in the course of this mission, he is perfectly willing to accept that kind of sacrifice.
Yeah. That's a dark place to go with a character, especially a character who, just last episode we saw doing Harry Kim stuff and just being Harry Kim.
Yep, it is. It's a really sharp contrast. And even in Garrett Wang's portrayal, there's a certain gravelly quality to his voice in the future timeline. Yeah. The way he carries himself, it is a very different contrast for the Harry Kim that we've gotten to know and love.
In this bright utopian future of Star Trek, I think that it, at least in the past, has been probably difficult for the writers to really make their characters dirty and kind of ding them up a little bit. They all have to be these kind of paragons. They come from the amazing Federation and Starfleet, which is the best of the best. And what I like in this episode, and what I really would have liked more of in the series, is the idea of, you've got Harry he's brilliant. He's been told he's brilliant. He was sort of pampered by his parents, and he designs this quantum slipstream drive, which is the answer to all their problems. Because of course he does. He's Harry Kim. He's 3-time Parisi Squares champion. And he's told by Tom, I don't think this is going to work. And he says, look, we'll fix this. I'll send you the adjustments. It's going to be fine. And they're not. Everybody dies except for him and Chakotay, and it nearly destroys him. He spends 15 years obsessed with fixing this problem. It's like the one answer he got wrong on the SATs, if he could just go back in time and get a perfect score. And Chakotay is not happy about what happened, but he's still Chakotay. He's got a new girlfriend. We get the idea he's got some kind of life. But you get the idea that Harry just can't move on from this. He can't even take the idea that he was wrong. And I think that that's really accurate for somebody who is used to being called exceptional, being the best, and being right, and finding themselves just unarguably wrong in this case.
Yeah, and I think there's another parallel to another Star Trek character to be made here in Ben Sisko at the very start of Deep Space Nine, when the wormhole aliens tell him, you exist here, referring to the moment in time where he suffered this great tragedy and lost his wife, that he never really moved on beyond that. And I think the future version of Harry Kim is in that same situation. He exists in that moment where he feels like he was responsible for the destruction of Voyager and the death of all of his crewmates.
Yeah, if he went into the wormhole, he would just be in that shuttle with Chakotay forever, just right after they've come out of the slipstream. Yeah.
Exactly.
I also think that Harry Kim would be a terror on Reddit. He'd be the guy going 15 replies deep with multi-paragraph responses to some minor disagreement that he had with somebody. He'd just have to be right. It's funny because at the end of the episode, our Harry, young Harry, he still doesn't know what went wrong. And when we see him in the mess hall late at night, and he's still poring over this data, trying to figure it out. And then he gets that message from himself in the future saying basically, hey, it's me or it's you, and I fixed it. And it's funny because I wouldn't call it a misstep necessarily, but the message could or arguably should have been, hey, even we make mistakes sometimes. Don't be arrogant because look what can happen. But instead, the message is more like, see, we got it right eventually. Of course we did. We're Harry Kim.
I agree with you completely on that point. When the last time I watched the episode, I kind of thought about that last scene where Harry watches his future self give him this quick message, and it's like, what exactly were the writers trying to communicate here? And I'm not sure I could come up with a really clear answer to that question. I'm not sure what the lesson was for Harry Kim from that message.
It's weird too, because just thinking about the parallel to yesterday's Enterprise. Yesterday's Enterprise, once they send the Enterprise C back and they fix everything, we flash back to regular Enterprise D, and they're like, it was a weird blip on the scanner. And they never know what Shooter McGavin and everybody else went through, on the Enterprise C. It's this dramatic irony. And in this, they could have just, Janeway says, we've got a guardian angel. It was just some weird transmission that Seven got. They could have left it there. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they pointedly decided to send this message for some reason, but the message is like, okay, not sure that was a real moral to the story, but okay, maybe it's just Harry seeing, I don't know, maybe it's Harry just seeing himself in the future, or seeing a more haggard version of himself in the future, and knowing that things are, there's real lives at stake here.
I guess if I were writing that scene, I probably would have reinforced the idea that Harry on Voyager, even though he's far away from his parents and far away from the Starfleet career that he envisioned, he is with a family. And so maybe that future version of the character could have been like, hey, you're surrounded by family where you are, and I don't want you to lose sight of that, because without that, things can get pretty dark. Something along those lines, I think, might have put more of a closing thought on the episode.
Yeah, 15 years later, I've got nothing. I'm in silver snow pants and I'm miserable. Yeah.
Yeah. I just got these snow pants and she's his girlfriend. So cherish what you've got on Voyager.
Yeah. I think Garrett Wang got something of a raw deal in working on the series. And I don't just mean Harry never getting promoted. Harry got some cool storylines, but the character, for the most part, always was still that same ensign. And Wang himself has talked about some of his frustrations with the series. He was the first and I think only cast member to be turned down for a directing job on the franchise. He went to the producers and asked for an episode to direct, like many cast members before him had, and he was flatly turned down. And that could have been a career turning point for him. Many Trek actors are now primarily TV directors post-Trek, like Jonathan Frakes and Roxanne Dawson and Robert Duncan McNeil.
Sure.
I mean, who's to say he may or may not have found success as a director, but he didn't even get a chance to try.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Why would he not be given the opportunity?
I have maybe his pitch wasn't good. I don't really know. And, when the fourth season was rolling around and they were adding 7 of 9 to the cast, they were considering, not just having Kess leave the show, they were looking at Harry Kim too. And it was just a quirk of fate that he had been featured in, I think, People magazine's like 50 Sexiest People or something like that year. And so the powers that be were like, all right, we'll keep him. We'll let Jennifer Lean go. So we might have had a Harry Kim-less second half of the series.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
He thank his good looks for that. It's a time.
He is a good-looking guy.
Yeah,
what a wonderful,
absolutely
bone
is.
structure, his face, jawline. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a time travel episode, kind of, as I mentioned. It's only information that time travels, but it brings up a moral question that I always think applies when you're dealing with alternate timelines and changing the past and time travel stories in Trek and other media. And what's interesting is that this episode actually addresses that question. We have Geordi LaForge himself say, stop messing around with time. It's too bad what happened, but you're going to erase everything that everybody's done or accomplished in 15 years. And that's not your call to make, ultimately.
Yeah, and even Captain Janeway at the very end, when she's talking to Harry Kim in our current timeline, she tells him, don't even try to make sense of these time paradoxes,
right.
which I have to think is probably the writers telling all of the fans, like, hey, don't, there's no need to pick this apart. That's not the point of the story.
Yeah.
You're thinking too hard about it. And so I actually really like that little bit of dialogue, because in the end, this is fiction and they're trying to tell us a really entertaining story.
Yeah.
And I think they succeeded here. So let's not think too hard about the mechanics of the time travel. That's not the point.
It's hilarious when you consider what, she ends up doing in the finale of Voyager, which is like, she goes from like, don't worry about time travel to like, we have to time travel.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to tell time travel stories, but historically, I've thought a lot about this. Historically, I think they usually break down to one of two schools. One, there's the Back to the Future style of time travel story. You change something in the past, it changes the future. You disappear from the photograph, or you have a nicer truck when you go back to the future. And number two, there's the more deterministic form of time travel story where any change you make was made in the past. So anything you do is just going to bring about that event that already exists, in the past. It's the Time Rider example, you are your own grandpa. But there's another option, something that I think media like comic books have been doing for years, and that's one that's been, it's also been recently popularized by movies like Avengers Endgame, which says that, yes, you can change things and change the future, but also everything that has happened has already happened. So you can go to a new shiny future, but it's an alternate timeline, and whatever thing you're trying to change has still happened somewhere. This is a nerdy reference, but it's like in Days of Future Past in the X-Men comics, Kate Pryde goes back in time and changes what happened to lead to her dystopia, but when she gets back to her time, still a dystopia. She's just created a timeline where that never happened.
Yep, and I'm glad you made the X-Men reference. I'm a huge X-Men fan. Huge Chris Claremont era fan, too.
Yeah. And Star Trek seems to like to play it both ways with time travel stories. You got something like the DS9 episode Time's Orphan, where, adult Molly saves child Molly, which wipes her out of existence, and it's a total paradox. But you've also got Time's Arrow from TNG, where they find Data's head in a cave, and they're like, how'd that get there? But then at the end of the episode, he's going to be wearing that head. Like they're going to go through the events that lead to that happening.
And then you've got Star Trek 2009, the film, where they explicitly say that they're creating an alternate timeline.
Right. What do you, if you had to speculate, what do you think is going on in pop culture that we're more willing to sort of look at it in that way? It isn't just, we've got to change something. Oh, thank God we restored things to the normal. Instead, we're like, no, there are splintering timelines and such.
Yeah, boy, that's a really good question that I hadn't really thought a lot about. My guess is maybe it's got something to do with the fact that all of these big pop culture is just crazy about these huge intellectual properties, whether it's comic books or Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever it is, these big universes where people have been telling stories in these universes going back decades. And it's really hard to keep track of all of that canon, all of those events and characters and things. And so you almost have to come up with a system where you can kind of compartmentalize it and pick and choose what stays part of the canon and what silly things we can kind of leave out, and what's immaterial. And so maybe time travel is a way to kind of reset the clock. And, we like these elements from the past, but we're going to forget some of these other elements, so we can kind of package what we like all together into a new film, a new rebooted film that people will still recognize as part of this bigger continuity.
Yeah. It is a little confusing though, still. Like, I'm not exactly sure how the time travel works, because they send a message back, but it's like the wrong message. And I think to keep the episode, the length that we have to have Harry get it wrong once. And also it affords us the opportunity to actually see Voyager then crash. But
yes.
Then he sends like the new message, which is basically just shut it down, shut it all down. Does that arrive before, or does it arrive, does it overwrite the message that was already sent? Is there a time, there's two timelines where Voyager crashed, or was that just the timeline that they're in? Yeah,
I guess my understanding of that was Harry could keep sending messages back.
Yeah, the Doctor says like the past isn't going anywhere.
Right. But the kind of the countdown clock that he was having to deal with was the fact that the Challenger was breathing down their neck.
Sure.
So he only had a certain number of opportunities to get that message back, and so I guess he got one do-over. He had enough time and enough power for one do-over.
Yeah, and then, of course the Doctor, who at first is reluctant, ends up sort of sacrificing himself for the cause. I thought that was kind of cool.
I thought that was a really lovely moment.
Yeah.
I thought the Doctor's not knowing if he'll ever be reactivated, but saying it's been a pleasure. Basically, for all he knows, he's sacrificing his life for this harebrained scheme.
Yeah.
He does it because he loves Chakotay and Harry and the rest of the Voyager crew, and he's willing to make that kind of sacrifice for them.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think about the ethics of this kind of time travel? Changing something for the supposed good, but of course affecting many, many other people's lives.
Well, I think Star Trek, because the Prime Directive is such a big deal, going back to the original series, that you can't really argue that this was the right call for anyone to be making, to go back and meddling with the past. I think if I were in that situation, I would be on Captain LaForge's side and not on Harry and Chakotay's. But I also completely understand the ties that you have to your best friends and your family, and you'd do almost anything if you thought you could bring them back to life. I understand that motivation. I totally relate to it.
Yeah.
I think if this were just some kind of some intellectual exercise where we're talking about the ethics, then I would come down on Geordi LaForge's side.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that Star Trek, in its many years of existence, can explore different sides and facets to that question. We go from, sorry, Edith Keeler, you got to go under that bus, to let's wipe out, 15 years of history to bring this small ship of 150 people back. It's funny too, because when we see the 29th century Federation time police, they're super cavalier about the kind of changes that they're making. Like they just pluck Seven from the time stream to make some changes, and then she fails and dies, and they're like, oh well, and then just grab her again from a different point. And that one time cop guy totally goes rogue and tries to just wipe out Voyager because it ruined his life. It's like, what kind of screening do these guys go through to become time cops? The temporal prime directive is right out the window in this episode. Of course, Harry and Chakotay aren't even Starfleet officers anymore, but the Doctor is a part of this episode. And I was wondering, would an EMH be programmed to not violate the temporal prime directive?
Yeah, that's interesting. That maybe part of his programming would keep him from. I guess maybe you could argue that he's a doctor and his job is to save lives, and they were attempting this harebrained scheme to save a bunch of lives. And we've seen over and over again that the Doctor, like Data, is able to overcome, to transcend their programming in various ways and grow over the course of the series.
Sure. There's a brief moment in the episode, and it can't persist because we've got to let the episode progress for them to do this. But there's a part where the Doctor says to Harry, hey, you got crazy survivor's guilt. I get it. But, maybe we should just let it be. We're messing with time. Maybe the best thing is to accept what happened. And of course, he's eventually convinced to their cause. And like we said, he sacrifices himself at the end, which I think is really great. It's kind of creepy, though. Like, the key to success in this is a chip that Seven has in her brain. So we beam her dead body up to the Delta Flyer, and then later on he's like digging around in her skull. There's some gruesome imagery in this episode.
It is gruesome, and they even show the kind of vivisectioned section of
yes.
Seven's cranium with some of the Borg implants still in it, and they don't really like linger on it or anything. It's treated pretty matter of fact.
It's almost grosser or like worse because it is so matter of fact.
But
he's a doctor. I like the bit of continuity too that they remembered that she had an artificial eye. So the eye is fine; it hasn't decomposed or anything like that. But now you've just got this half a skull with an eye sticking out of it.
Yep, definitely one of the more gruesome bits of Bourbon era Star Trek. I think
macabre. Yeah. I want to talk about treason. Harry and Chakotay are wanted for treason, and treason in the Federation is interesting. It doesn't get kicked around a lot. As a nation, even a nation as accepting as the Federation, you're still going to have national interests, and you don't want those subverted necessarily. But I would hope that treason is something that isn't tossed around that much. I don't think it's ever mentioned in TNG. It might be mentioned in TOS, and then suddenly when Voyager comes around, you've got people mentioning treason a little more. And so I just wonder what your thoughts would be about the what kind of crime would the egalitarian Federation say, well, that's treason. I mean, that's the worst thing that you can do. And of course, we don't have the death penalty, but you're going away for a while, pal.
Yeah, treason, I guess, is an interesting word to use. I mean, they stole the Delta Flyer. I don't know if that would be considered treason. I mean, we saw Kirk and his friends steal the Enterprise from space dock.
Right. Yeah.
And they had some. I mean, they kind of hand waved the consequences that they had to face as a result of that, and going to the Genesis planet, which was supposed to be forbidden. I don't know what exactly they did that would be considered treason. I guess messing with the timeline, but
I guess.
We see a lot of characters do that as well. So, yeah, I don't know.
I like that their justification is, we did some crimes, but we're just going to wipe away those crimes from happening, which is kind of like saying, yeah, you saw me commit a murder, but if I kill you, nobody saw me commit the murder. Like the moral flexibility is at its height in this episode.
Well, I'll tell you, and maybe this kind of speaks to that point, that the charges against Kim and Chakotay are sort of nebulous here.
Yeah.
There's a really cool scene where Chakotay is talking with Captain LaForge over the view screen, and it's like, LaForge kind of communicates to them that this is my job. I don't really want to bring you in. I understand why you're doing this, but I'm under orders and I have to try to bring you in. And he kind of, he says, good luck, Captain. And, and there's like, it's not personal between Chakotay and LaForge. It's just, this is their orders.
Yeah. Well, I like how T says good luck and LaForge says good luck to you too. And it's like, well, you don't really want him to have good luck, do you? It's sort of like when the server says, enjoy your meal, and you say, you too.
Yeah, I think I kind of took that line to mean like, I hope you don't rewrite the timeline, but I hope nothing really bad. I don't wish you ill.
I hope the best outcome comes out of this. Yeah, I can see that. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about the episode? Any last thoughts that you had as we wrap up here?
Well, I guess to maybe circle back to a point I made earlier about how the future timeline in Timeless takes place in 2390, and we see that Romulus gets destroyed in 2387. So I recently read the Una McCormick novel for the Picard universe, The Last Best Hope.
Yeah.
And so I know that novels, you got to be careful. You can't really accept them as canon until until you see it confirmed on screen. But in that book, we see that Picard, when he leaves the Enterprise, he convinces LaForge to go to Utopia Planitia and start building the fleet of ships that's going to help with the evacuation of Romulus. And so if that really happened, then the LaForge that we saw as captain of the Challenger is years after that, after we've already seen Utopia Planitia destroyed and we saw the mission to Romulus turned out disastrously. And so I just really like the idea that LaForge is able to bounce back from that, continue his career in Starfleet, and become the captain of a starship. I like that character arc, and if that were to be made canon, I would be really satisfied with that.
Yeah, that would be great. It occurs to me now, too, that I think Geordi LaForge is kind of a Harry Kim-esque character himself. He's also, Harry Kim's parents weren't in Starfleet, but LaForge's parents were in Starfleet, and he's, this brilliant guy who sees this meteoric rise from helmsman to the chief engineer of the flagship. And it's almost like what Harry Kim's career could have been, if the whole caretaker incident hadn't happened.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I like that.
But of course, all these people's and all these characters' stories have been expounded upon in tie-in media. So if you're looking to find out what happens when they get back, there are plenty of Kirsten Beyer novels for you to read.
Yep,
in
whole
that avenue. Yeah. Well, let's talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
Definitely Picard, without hesitation. I think because Star Trek The Next Generation was the series that got me into Star Trek. I love that cast. I love those characters. It was such a thrill to see Picard back on the screen for a whole nother series just this year. And I think Picard, as a character, he has such high standards for himself and those around him that he kind of lifts the people around him up to his level. Yeah. And there's an aspirational quality to Jean-Luc Picard. And I've always try to live up to those same sort of standards. I don't always, but I think that's what I love about Captain Picard is that he makes people around him better, even in the real world.
Yeah, certainly. Now that we've reached the end of the show, you'll receive a commission and the rank of ensign. What department on the ship do you work in?
I've always wanted to be a flight controller, a helmsman. Yeah, I think it'd be cool to be like a hotshot pilot, like Paris, like Tom Paris.
Yeah, there's definitely a different sort. I mean, I suppose hotshot pilots are hotshot pilots in any era, but going from, grabbing the stick, and doing barrel rolls and stuff like that to now the person with the best words per minute, I guess, is the best pilot, because you're using, little buttons and beep, 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 beep and stuff like that. But yeah, I'd be interested someday for them to really explain how, these tight, maneuvers work using like a keyboard or whatever it is. Of course, in Star Trek Insurrection, we have the get out the joystick. This is going to be an important maneuver here. But we never see that anywhere else in the franchise.
They should do a short trek that's all about the helmsman of a starship giving like a brief flight control lesson. I would love that.
Or like a Whiplash style thing where the guy just keeps practicing and his fingers are all bruised and he's got calluses and he's like, I gotta be the best pilot. I gotta keep working these fingers. I'm obsessed. Well, Ensign Love, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can, at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as well, pretty active, talking about Star Trek and tabletop role-playing games as well. It's at Trek_Lug, L-U-G.
Trek Lug. And I know that, the quarantine has canceled a lot of your music dates, but do you have any upcoming dates or events that you want to share with the audience?
I would just, if people are interested in Star Trek Adventures, the role-playing game, check out my YouTube page. I'm running games on that regularly. I also, I've got a Facebook music page as well, Fred Love Music. I'm doing live stream concerts every Saturday afternoon, Central Time. I do like old school country music and Americana kind of stuff. So if that's of interest to you, then please feel free to stop on by.
Yeah, check that out. Thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.
Your Honor, a courtroom is a crucible. In it we burn away irrelevancies until we are left with a pure product, the truth, for all time.
Oh man, this is so intense. Data's on trial for his life.
I know. This episode, The Measure of a Man, is based on the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision of 1857.
And every week on Backtracking, we take a look at the real-world events that inspired classic Star Trek episodes. Sorry.
Shut up!
Shh.
Who are you?
We're the hosts of Backtracking. I'm Caliban.
You will both be taken to the brig and from there to the nearest starbase, where you will answer charges for what you have done.
And I'm Gooey Fame.
This is not a game. This is life and death.
You can follow us on Twitter.
Backtracking is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
You go f*** yourself.